Hello, I'm Eric, and I was listening to an episode of Mormon Stories podcast this morning. And the topic they were talking about was a talk that was given last night on February 6th by Bradley Wilcox. And as I was listening to the episode, and as they were kind of commenting on what was said, I found myself experiencing a lot of emotions, and a lot of things were racing through my mind, and I just wanted to capture some of those. I don't know that I'll necessarily share this, but it's something that I wanted to make for my own sanity. Just for a little bit of background, I am no longer an active Mormon. I haven't actually left the church. However, I have not participated in it for several years, and I am still working on processing everything that goes along with leaving a high demand religion like Mormonism. And so my primary motivation behind capturing this video is to verbalize those thoughts and help make sense of them. So without any further ado, we'll go ahead and give this a listen. The gospel.
Well, today I want to talk to you a little bit about the gospel. We sang about it. We sang about it as we sang, "We thank thee, O God, for a prophet." We heard the word gospel in that hymn, and we're going to talk a little bit about the gospel because you know that I want to read you something that I read in the newspaper. This, children, is called a newspaper.
Okay, so I had started watching this video when I decided that I actually wanted to document this process. And it was at this point where I really started having a strong reaction where he uses the words, "This, children, is called a newspaper." And just the pure patronization of the youth that he is speaking to. Now, I realize that the audience that he is speaking to is anywhere between the ages of 12 and 18. And so, technically, yes, could still be called children. However, just using that terminology, it was just something that didn't sit right with me. It felt really condescending. And it's like, I understand that media has changed a lot since Brad was a kid, and it's changed a lot since even I was a kid. But to present it like that, I just imagine holding up a floppy disk and saying, "This, children, is called a floppy disk," and just how patronizing that sounds. And so just the general attitude that was presented just felt really condescending. And as far as a gut reaction, I would have a hard time taking Brad seriously being talked to like that. And it's just, I remember sometimes the things that would go on in church and the infantilization that would sometimes happen. It's hard to think of specifics, but I love looking at one of the counselors or whatever there that's on the right that is kind of scratching his head as if he's saying, as if he's thinking, did he really just say that? But I don't know what he's thinking, but in my mind, I'm going to pretend that that's what he was thinking. So we'll go ahead and continue. I had watched up to this point, but everything else from this point on will be fresh.
We used them in the olden days.
More
Look how
patronization.
we scrolled down. Whoa! Whoa, did you see that?
Okay, no reaction from the audience, or at least none that was audibly picked up by the cameras. So it's like, I get he's probably trying to be funny, but it landed flat. So I suspect these youth have a similar feeling where they're not being as taken in by it as he might like.
Oh, well, in the newspaper, it says that young people are leaving religion, and it compared your generation to my generation on 4 important questions. Number 1, is religion very important? 59% of my generation said yes. 41% of your generation said yes.
Now, to go along with this first point, I was, as I think about it now, thinking about how ambiguous sometimes these survey questions are. Is religion important? And as I've been deconstructing and thinking about how religion had played a part in my life, I know that it was immensely important to me. It was everything. It formed who I was, my day to day actions with other people. My thoughts were very much influenced by my religious upbringing. And it's just like, there's that classic what would Jesus do thing, and just like that mantra, how often it repeated in my mind. And so, as far as importance as to how one approaches their daily life, yes, the gospel was definitely something that was very important to me. And it's interesting to think about how that word important could apply to different things. It's like are important as far as forming a basis of morality, important in forming an identity, important in deciding who you're going to vote for, important as to the interactions you have with your fellow men, and just how much all of those things combine. And so it's like, as far as importance, it's an ambiguous question. I wish it were more specific. And so pinning numbers on these is, I mean, it can be kind of informative, but always taken with a grain of salt, and trying to think about how people would react internally to those questions is something I think that's really important.
Yes. Do you attend weekly religious services? 38% of your generation said yes, 27% of my generation said yes.
It's interesting how we're supposedly a Christian nation, and yet over half of the people don't attend religious services weekly, whether it's his generation or the youth. I think it's really interesting to see how that's fallen from a third to a quarter in a matter of a generation. And it will be interesting to see how it fall if it continues to fall in the coming generation. It'll be fun to watch.
Do you pray at least once a day? 61% of my generation said yes. 42% of your generation said yes.
It's really interesting to think about people praying, because as I think about my own personal experiences with prayer, I prayed a lot, and there were a lot of times where I felt like I got answers. But as I've deconstructed and thought more about whether or not I was actually receiving answers from some divine entity, or whether or not it was just something I made up in my mind, I have come to lean more and more towards I felt what I wanted to feel most at crucial times in my life. Otherwise, prayers are mostly, at least to me, felt like nothing more than speaking empty words into the void. And while I realize there's something kind of ironic in talking to a camera and speaking these words into a void, whether or not I put this up on YouTube and other people watch it, or whether or not I keep it to my own, it's still, I will concede that there is some value in vocalizing your thoughts. It helps to crystallize them. It helps to see exactly how you're thinking and what you're thinking, and how it can also help draw out emotions. It can help you see what emotions you're feeling. And the nice thing about prayer is, or one of the nice things that can come from prayer is, that normally it's something that's practiced in solitude. And so it gives you a chance to distance yourself from the screens, from the noise of the outside world and all of the distractions that come along with it, and gives you a chance to reflect. And I think that's something that's really important and not something that should be undervalued. So while the key component of whether or not you're talking to a deity is something that's very much up in the air, pun intended, uh, the fact that you're vocalizing those thoughts, I do think, whether or not you're religious, can have some value.
And do you believe in heaven? 74% of my generation said yes, and 67% of your generation said yes.
it's so interesting. The concept of heaven is while religious attendance is something that's very low, a belief in some kind of afterlife, I think is something that resonates with a lot of people. And it's something that strikes home for me because my grandma's birthday was yesterday. And thinking about how it's been, a good almost 30 years now since she passed away, there is still some grief, I think, within me where, I very much would like to think that my grandma and my grandpa are together because my grandpa passed away a couple of years ago. And so thinking about them, and I can imagine, I mean, the appeal and the draw of religion is greatly one that says that our life is not confined or uh, confined to this existence, to mortality. And so I do see the appeal of wanting to believe that there is something that comes after this life. The justification of which I don't think is really there, other than an extreme human desire to think that life continues after death.
Now you can see that those numbers are going down in every category. And you don't need a newspaper to tell you that. Because how many of you know somebody who used to go to church who no longer goes to church? Raise your hands if you know somebody. Yeah, look at all those hands. Now, let me tell you two things about that. Number one, our church is doing much better than many churches.
All right. And so while there was a point before where I hadn't seen that was highlighted in the Mormon Stories podcast, this section was. And I remember thinking to myself that, or at least the reactions from Kara and John, were that Mormonism is a very high demand religion. It places a great amount of controls and influences on the things that you will ingest as far as media and the voices that you will listen to. And that's one of the forms of control that they use. And while I remember as a practicing member of the Mormon Church, I was very much averse to the idea of being called a cult. But as I have deconstructed and have learned about something called the bite model, one of those key things that religion will control is information. And when they do that, it's very easy to insulate yourself in a bubble. And so when you're not exposing yourself to outside influences, it's really easy to say, well, this is what you should think, and it's very hard to get out of that. And so it was just really interesting to see that the main reason that people remain in the church, or why Mormonism may be doing better than other churches, is because they have that much higher level of control over the information that people will consume. And while other Christian faiths definitely do have that, it's like, oh, if it's not the Bible, discard it. I have frequently thought about the car salesman analogy, where you go to buy a car and the car salesman tells you all of the great things about their cars, and the informed consumer would not just take that salesman's word for it. They would go out and they would check other dealerships and see what they might say. They might take the car to a mechanic and get their opinion. They don't just take the salesman's word for it. And that's something that happens in the church, where it's like, don't question the prophets. They are speaking for God. They know the truth, and you should doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith. And that's something that is very much emphasized, or definitely was as I was a practicing Mormon, and that's something that's still stuck with me. And so I really think that's something that may be a contributing factor to the fact that this is a high demand religion, and that's the reason that it may be doing better as far as the loss. But I think they are still experiencing the loss as many other faiths are.
as people are turning away in a secular world from all things religious, many churches are being hurt by it. Our church is weathering that storm much better than most churches, and especially much better than most Christian churches. I know you think, whoa, but everybody's leaving the church. No, if you actually look at the numbers.
Okay, and this was another point where I remember thinking, looking at the numbers, what numbers? Are they published? Has the church said these are the number of active members in the church? I do know that in conference, the church will report on the total membership, or at least they sometimes have. I know one of the last conferences that I really listened to, the church membership was at around 11 million. Granted, this was a good 10 years ago, probably at this point. It was actually probably closer to 13 now that I think about it. But the point is that I don't know that they report on those continue overall numbers, nor do they report on the active numbers. And so it's nice to say look at the numbers when they're not published.
There's not any more leaving now than have left at any generation in the history of the church.
And we just have to take your word for it.
In Kirtland, Ohio. People left once the Saints moved to Salt Lake. I mean, people have left the church in every generation, and the numbers aren't that different.
Again, we have no way of knowing that. Please show us the numbers. That's something that, if the church were so invested in truth that they wouldn't be afraid of putting those numbers out there for the membership to see. It's the same with the financial records. It's like they always talk about how they're complying with all these various rules and regulations that are put forth by the government, but we don't know what those numbers actually are. It's like, how much money is the church bringing in on an annual basis? How much of that is from tithing? How much of that is from offerings? How much of that goes to the individual members? And while they say it's an unpaid clergy within Mormonism, how much money the general authorities from the 70s up to the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and the First Presidency all get a monthly stipend. And granted, these were all usually reasonably wealthy men before they are called to be apostles and 70s within the church. It's like they still draw a salary. And I think that's very much, even though it may sound somewhat empty as a former theist, to say that the membership of the apostles traveled without person script. The church definitely is not at that point now. They have billions of dollars, and they could be doing so much with it that could be used for the betterment. But instead, they have these men giving these talks that may or may not be benefiting the membership of the church.
The difference is that now people leave very publicly. Where people used to just step away and nobody knew about it, now they leave on TikTok, and thousands of people watch them as they sit and gripe about the church.
Okay, a couple of points here where he's talking about people leaving the church publicly. This is one of the great things of social media, is that people actually have the chance to be open about the fact that they have left the church, and that the church cannot control the information that goes out about that person to the degree that they once were able to. When somebody decides that they want to leave the church, they can say on Facebook, here are the reasons why. And that is definitely more visible. More people see that because there are venues to broadcast it. And in the past, before the internet, it's like they didn't have those channels, and it was much easier to shame people that were leaving and to keep them thinking that they were the odd people out, that they were different, that they were the black sheep, and all of these negative things that go along with leaving that can go along with leaving your faith. When in reality, lots of people lose their faith. Lots of people do it for good reasons. The church is not a one size fits all thing. Like so many things in life, there is not a black and white. There are ways that you can live a good life without the church. There are ways to be mentally healthy outside of the church. And to say that people are leaving it and griping about the fact that they're leaving, it's like I think about it and people are not as gripey. It's like this is just influencing the youth that he's speaking to think negatively about people who leave the church rather than looking at them with compassion and trying to look at them with understanding and trying to see and understand the reasons that people are leaving. So many people have issues with church history, with polygamy, with blacks in the priesthood, and all of these different things that I know will eventually be talked about. But just thinking about how he's castigating these people, me personally, the reason that I left the church was I just did not find the experience that I expected to match up with what I was actually experiencing within the church. As far as the doctrine of the atonement and the need for a savior, it's like those were things that I very much believed in and wanted. It's like there is a mighty change of heart talked about over and over and over in the scriptures. There are multiple references stating, ask and ye shall receive, knock and it shall be opened unto you. Where whenever I felt like I was asking, whenever I was knocking, nobody was answering the door and no answers came. And I just felt like, as with prayer, my efforts were just being thrown into the void and not landing anywhere. And that was one of the biggest motivations for me to question and to say, you know what, this is not working the way I expect it to. Why is that? Is it more likely because there's a God who is withholding answers from me? Or is it because there isn't a God at all? And over time, I have come more and more to the conclusion that there's nobody listening. Whether or not that's true, I can't say with absolute certainty, but that is the way that I lean.
And so, because it's so public, then we think, oh, everybody's doing it. But that's not the case. The church is strong. The youth of the church are strong. The young single adults of the church are strong. And there's not that many more leaving now than there were when I was growing up. It's just happening in a much more public way. Now, what scares me about people making the choice to leave isn't that we have a few less people in the church. Doesn't.
And this was another point where I thought, it doesn't bother you that people are leaving the church? It's my understanding is that this gospel is for everybody. And so if it's for everybody, they're leaving it behind. That should really concern you. I know he makes a point here in a minute about the church being within the people, but even that, it's like it's not the organization of the church itself that I think should be the most important thing. If I were thinking from a theological standpoint, trying to think from my point of view when I was a practicing Mormon, it's not the church that I want in people. It would be a testimony of Jesus Christ. And that is just something that I yearned for, and that's what I wanted more than anything. I didn't care about the church. I didn't care about the organization. I cared about that relationship. And the fact that it felt like it was empty, that there was nothing there, that it was unfruitful, that was what led me to leave.
It doesn't bother me that we have fewer people sitting in the pews. What bothers me is that we have the church in fewer people. That's what bothers me. Because they're going to face the same challenges we face. They're going to face the same struggles and the same trials and the same heartbreaks. And they're choosing to do it in the absolute hardest way possible.
You see, and that's the other thing. We're all facing the same challenges whether or not we're inside the church. There's nothing magical about the church that makes life any easier. There's nothing about being in the church that makes it less heavy. There's nothing within the church that makes things in that makes things surmountable that are otherwise challenging. And I would say it's the contrary. There are many things that the church piles onto people that cause anxiety, that cause depression, that cause people to think that life might not be worth living because I'm not living up to all of the expectations that this religion is placing on me. And so I am completely 100% in disagreement with this idea that life is easier inside the church.
They're choosing to do it without God, without Christ, without the church. By leaving the church, it doesn't mean that they escape the trials of life. It just means they escape the blessings that can help them deal with the trials
Could you be more specific about that? What blessings exactly are you speaking of?
of life. We know that the Lord said, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden."
It says that in the scriptures, yes, but that's something else about the scriptures is we don't know that Christ actually said these things. It wasn't like Christ wrote these things down and said, "These are my words." They're all secondhand accounts of people who lived years after Jesus Christ. It's like these things were not written down until decades after Christ was killed, if he existed at all. And so it's purported that he said these things, but what actual evidence is there that they were said? And so that's the first point. The second point is, again, there is nothing within the church that makes life more bearable. It may give you some hope that you can overcome these challenges. It may give you some strength, but there is nothing that says that you can't find hope outside of the church. As a matter of fact, the church is very much against R-rated movies. However, one of my favorite movies is The Shawshank Redemption, and in that movie is one of my absolute favorite quotes. It says, "Hope is a good thing, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." And there is nothing about hope that I think necessarily entails religion or a church or a God to say that you must have God, religion, faith, churches in order to have hope. You can still hope that the sun will rise tomorrow. You can still hope that your relationships with your friends and family will be better tomorrow than they were today. There's nothing inherent in the church that says you're going to be that much better off believing in these things because you're inside the church. You can have just as much hope outside as in.
"And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest to your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."
Ask anybody who's struggling with depression how true they think that statement is. Ask them how heavy they think the yoke is, how light the burden is. I can tell you from my personal experience that being within the church did not make depression any easier to deal with. As a matter of fact, I found it much easier to deal with when I unleashed myself from the demands and the expectations of the church to live a certain way, to do all of these things: home teaching, ministering, bringing more people into the church, paying tithing. So many things have changed for me since leaving the church. While leaving the church was hard and there was a lot of grieving that had to go on and is still going on in my heart, leaving it has opened the door for me to say that the church is not necessary. It's not the end all be all. It's not the only way that people can find happiness. And so to claim this monopoly on it is a lie, and I would say even a damnable lie. And it's reprehensible to me that people will claim to speak for God and tell other people that this is the way when it's a lie.
Now, some people, as they walk away from the church, they think they're losing the labor part. They think they're losing the heavy laden part. But what they're really losing,
They are definitely losing a lot of heavy burdens. Again, family home evening once a week, morning scripture study, going to church for hours on Sunday, all of the meetings that you're expected to go through throughout the week, young men's, young women's, primary, youth activities, all of these different things. There is so much that the church puts on its members, and I think keeps them busy and distracted from really thinking about what might lie outside of it. So many times I heard in church, I don't know where I would be without the church. And I think the reason people make that proclamation is because they don't have the time to really think about where they could be outside of the church.
Is the light and easy part. Life is the heavy laden part. And they are losing the easy and light way of being able to face the realities of life.
No, there is nothing light, there is nothing easy about facing the realities of life. Life is hard. Life is a challenge. And if it's not, I don't think you're really living it. If it's not challenging, if it's not heavy at times, you're living in a bubble. And I pause only because I have tried to escape it and I can't. And as much as I wanted to within the church to try to escape and find rest and find comfort, the times that I really did were so few and far between that I can't see them as anything other than happenstance and just I happen to be in the right place at the right time because otherwise I don't really know where I was going with this thought, but I just know that being inside the church always made me feel overwhelmed.
So tonight, let's talk about 6 different doctrines that you find here in the church that you can't find elsewhere.
Uh, you see, there's that claim to exclusivity again. It's like we're part of the in group. We have this claim on truth that nobody else has. It's like that's one of the my hangups is if this was something that God wanted everybody to know, why don't more people know it? Why aren't more people given the opportunity to know it? I think that if there is truly a battle between God and Satan, Satan's winning. There are, like I said, at least the last time I remember hearing a number, 13 million members of the church. There are what, coming on 7 billion people on the earth today? 13 million out of many billion. And that's just today. It's like that ratio going back to 1820 becomes a lot smaller, becomes non existent prior to 1820. And so the church and God's plan, if he really wanted us to have it, I think could do a much better job at making it available if he existed.
Maybe some people can leave some churches and they don't miss that much. But you leave this church, you miss everything.
See, that's more entrapment, that's more information control, thought control, saying that see, it's that fear of missing out that has become a pretty common moniker today. It's that saying if you go outside this church, you're not going to find anything but a world of hurt outside. And so, it's that fear tactic where people aren't given a real informed consent type of situation where they can say, is this the best fit for me? It's like, well, if it's so bad out there, I guess I'll stay in here. And it's not really offering people a choice.
You miss everything. Let's talk about the blessings of the gospel that you can only find here. We're going to tie each one up to a letter in the word gospel, Gospel. As easily as you can spell the word, you're going to be able to remember what we learned. And when you go home and your mom says, "What did you learn at the fireside?" you're actually going to be able to tell her. And that will be a miracle.
A miracle, being able to remember what you were taught a few hours before. I think again, it's that disingenuousness, that condescension. Again, I think just treating these kids as if they're kids and not teaching them how to think and be the adults that they are becoming. Okay, so final thoughts. Um, just recapping, it's the exclusivity of the church that just blows my mind. The way that it tries to keep people within by making them scared of what might lie outside. I think that really, really bothers me the most. And saying that this is the only avenue to happiness, this is the only avenue to get all of the blessings that you could possibly get in this life and in the next, I think is just so contrary to a God that is supposedly loving, merciful, and just, who wants to extend us all of these blessings, but he's just so choosy about how he doles them out. I just can't reconcile those statements. It causes too much cognitive dissonance, and it's another one of the many reasons that I left the church, and am grateful to find a way out of it, so that and to find people who are able to find happiness, who are able to find greater health, who are able to be who they are, and without that expectation of trying to fit into the mold that the church would try to put you in. And that is really all I have to say about this particular video. And we'll continue with the next one when I'm up for it. Bye.